Hey, good woodworkers. So, getting prepared to veneering our curved apron for demi loom table or whatever curved pieces you would need. So, just as a reminder, after I got the glue ups done, I used my bow over this curve, tracing off of my full-size drawing, took it here, trued it up on an edge sander. Once this matched to my full-size drawing once again, then I offset this to whatever the thickness is I want. For here I'm going somewhere in the neighborhood of about 7/8 of an inch. You can go 3/4, you can go thinner than that, but there is going to be a drawer in this area here, so I do need to leave enough space for joinery and just enough grab to pull this thing open with. So, alright, so this is the piece. I have fared out the interior curve and the exterior curve again, both on the edge sander. Those are probably the most efficient ways of doing this. I've also flattened my veneer, so this piece is ready to go. You can see it's over length from what I need, as well as my curve, also much bigger than I need, which is good. It's always easier to cut more material off than it is to put it back on. So this piece of veneer has an issue here. It has some checking. That sometimes happens as you're flattening. If you've got a lot of ripples, then as that pressure is compressing these ripples and flattening everything else out, sometimes it has a failure point where it can no longer hold. Usually it's just in the ends. So because this is longer than I need, I'll be able to cut this off and I'm in good shape. In anticipation of this glue up, this is obviously the veneer is much larger or wider than it needs to be for the curved apron. So I need to protect the ends of the board, and any tape will work with this. I prefer blue tape just because of the tackiness or the ease of pulling it back off should you need to. Alright, so I'm in good shape there. That looks like I've got plenty and no real issues. So what I'm going to do, whenever you're working on a darker veneer or a darker wood for that matter, regular number 2 pencils are mostly worthless as far as drawing the line that you'll be able to see, but with a lighter pencil, this is charcoal, white charcoal pencil, then I can see what I'm doing. So, alright, getting rid of this. Because this check is here and I've taped, I'm going to clear off some of this space and get rid of the excess. If you don't tape here, then you're going to find it's much more prone for splitting as you're doing that cut. So this piece now, you can see where the issue is or was by that little gap. So getting rid of that. Now the next thing I need to do is going to cut through the length of this. And so I have had some success with using scissors to follow that line to cut, but you're going to be much more prone that, especially if you've got figured woods or woods that are more interesting visually. Straight grain woods sometimes do okay, but with doing this, the grain is going to start to feel the force of that cutting, and it's going to start to split or spread in places you don't want it to. So there's a couple of other tools that we can use. In essence, I'm looking for getting a nice straight cut, obviously with the least amount of damage. Alright, so I think I'm midway through. Where's my measuring tool? I have no idea. Alright, so that's that. For cutting veneer, there are these things called veneer saws, and these work great in theory. Very small teeth, but they have no set here, so I can push this up against a straight edge and be able to pull this thing all the way across, and I have good separation of this. It's a clean cut, it's not an amazing cut. I find that these veneer saws work much better than something like this, where if I were to score this thing across, you're still prone to having the grain of the wood kind of dictate where these things cut. Same rule applies with a marking knife. You can do things with it, but you're going to have problems with where the things ends up. So a couple different ways to do it. I think the veneer saws are an easy way to go. You can use veneer saws on cutting across the grain as well. But you have to be very careful at the end of the cut, because that's where this thing is going to start to tear out if you pull this all the way off of the board. So let me get rid of this. Let me refocus into what we're seeing. Okay. So again, using a straight edge here, I can pull off of the veneer as I'm sawing it, and with the radius edge of the saw, you do kind of want to find all of those teeth as you're cutting. The real danger here is when you cross cut, because anything that happens here where you're cutting, all of the material that you want to save is going to start to tear out in big swaths. So I always cut towards the center of the board on both of these, and then that minimizes any of that splitting that happens if you need to use a veneer saw for that. Again, I like scissors for cutting veneers. They work, and they're relatively easy to do. Okay, so getting rid of this piece, I will use that for my second cut. I'm sorry, for my second veneer. I'm going to start with cutting, I keep saying cutting. I'm going to start with veneering the exterior of this curve first, and I'll get into this as I'm gluing it up. But as you can see, there's plenty of extra width, there's plenty of extra length on what this is that I'm looking at and doing. Let me make sure I'm still recording. Cool. Now, I can't just adhere this thing on without any good pressure supporting the curve as I start to clamp this thing on. And for these purposes, I'm going to be using a PVA glue, so water-based glue. They have a cold pressed veneer glue, which is best for this. It's a little bit thicker. It doesn't have the tendency of bleeding, and it has a little bit more in the way of open time for what it is we're doing, but not a ton. So it's not great for joinery, but it's great for a veneer, and that's what we're doing. So, okay, so with this, I want to make sure to have a couple of center lines, kind of getting me where I want to be. I have a center line on my curve, and that gets transferred down here, transferred there. And that way, if anything starts to go out of line, I can start to catch it earlier than once I commit. Now, when I apply pressure to these things, there's a couple of different things I could use. There's this bendable plywood material, and this is not technically bendable plywood or wiggle wood, but this is a very thin piece of masonite with some MDF adhered to it, and then they did these relief cuts which cause this thing to bend. This is going to make a perfect call for fighting against that clamping pressure. The other thing that I use is just masonite here. This is a 1/4 inch piece of masonite. It's got a decent amount of flex to it, not quite as flexible as this bendable stuff is, but they both do a really great job. The problem with this situation is that I need to have a couple of layers of this material in order to get the proper displacement of pressure. If I were to just use one layer of this to adhere it on, then anywhere I have clamps, and I'm just going to use F-clamps, the pressure between these pads is going to be localized or focused on just those spots where the pads are. And so by adding up a couple of layers of this material, then I should have a good chance of displacing that pressure, getting a nice even bend to this as I clamp it up. So, so that's the idea. All right, so I've got these pieces are going to go on first, those will go on after, and I should be able to make this happen. Getting rid of excess material there. And where are my calls? Oh, there you are. shortly. Alright, so when applying adhesive for things you're going to veneer, you always need to remember one important rule, which is to not ever apply adhesive or PVA adhesive or epoxy. You could also use epoxy in very much the same way for what we're doing. Only apply it to your substrate or the solid material. Never apply this via a roller, especially to the veneer itself. If I were to do this to the veneer, I'm going to start to run into this problem where I'm rolling this down, but it tends to want to lift up. Anytime I do this, that's exactly what happens. And so it just starts to get really grabby, and it's not necessary. If it's a water-based adhesive, which this is, then it's also going to start to introduce some swelling into the veneer. And that could start to throw you off because it will start to retain any of those buckles or things that you were working on very hard to flatten prior to the step. So, see, I'm using a really cheap roller here. For a while I used a metal roller in this little container, and then it took about 4 minutes to realize that that was a bad idea because it started to rust inside the container. So rollers are great because they provide an even distribution of adhesive, which is really important here. If I have little globs, or if I were to pour this on with a glue bottle, it's just not going to spread out the way that it needs to. I'm going to do one other thing I just realized. And practice. Aligning all of those pieces, now I'm ready to start doing the fun stuff, or the stuff that's crazy making if it goes wrong. Alright, lining up center marks, that looks pretty good. Now I'm going to use this layer on the interior. Then when I'm ready to start clamping, I'm also going to start putting in some of these chunks here. And these are pieces from the cutoff of my curve that I created. So these ones already have a slight radius, so as I'm clamping this down here, it's not going to create these pinch points on the corners. It will start to follow that curve. It doesn't have to be exact, but it will be close. And the laws or the rules of clamping will suggest that the greater the distance I have between those clamping pads, the more surface area I'm going to be creating pressure in. This is why woodworking is sometimes better done in teams or pairs. So with only one clamp in place, it's really easy to pivot this and start to follow my lines again. Now that you got that first one, you're ready to rock. So whenever using PVA glue, as you know, there is a ticking clock to make sure that you get everything where you need to before it starts to set. And good preparation and making sure that you're starting off well is the most important thing you can do. So I just want to make sure that my cauls were in place before I overcommitted to putting these things around. It doesn't really matter where I clamp with respect to working your way out from the center and then going all the way to the left, or my left as I'm doing, or all the way to the right. What I want to do is keep working from the center point, and because I think the alignment is a little bit easier that way. So from the center and then working my way slowly out to one direction. If I work from here and then way over here, there's going to be a bubble on that veneer face that I can't really get out. And as I said, that adhesive, when it starts to set up, you are really limited with what options you have to correct it. Okay, not much more to do. I'm going to continue both of these sides and then check for any gaps that I might have from this view. But if I'm in good shape here, I'm happy. I don't need to bore you with watching the rest of the details. Thank you very much.